Today we're going to look inside a 725 and a 525 and see what differences there are mechanically. Both guns stand up very well in terms of working actions. The 525 has been around significantly longer and is much closer to the original superposed. The 725 is a supposed improvement, a slimline, more intelligently designed gun. More computers involved. Well, there you go. We've got the magic measuring tool, we've got some eyes, we've got a camera. Let's see the difference. So evidently they are different, and we're going to start at the front and work our way to the back. So the barrels are different. We're not going to talk about that because the barrel tech can vary from model to model. So let's start with the fore-end irons. If we pull these off quickly, let's just have a quick measure in terms of length from back to front. They are pretty much identical. They're a millimeter different. And in terms of depth, this is where the real difference will be. 42.5 and 41. So that's the real difference here. As you can see, the actual springs, the guides, everything about these is the same. The only thing that does look slightly different here is the depth of the kickers. That's 21, as is this. So, ergo, the actual fore-end irons and ejection systems are pretty much identical. And just to back that up, we'll have a little look here at the ejectors. The systems are at full stretch back, or full closure, it's going to be a better example, identical. So it's reasonable to assume that, seeing as the geometry of these is identical, as is the fore-end irons, that the Browning ejection system changes zero between the two, and as such, the reliability and issues between them are going to be much the same. What does change slightly is the actual geometry at the backs here, but that's by the by. As such, I would probably see the 725 is ever so slightly better just because it's more concise and condensed, but that could actually swing both ways, so we'll move off of that entirely. So now, having established that the front half is very similar, let's take a look to the backs. And we all know that the real difference between the two, more than anything, and the most advertised point, is that the 725 is a mechanical trigger. I've shown you, and we're going to cover some old ground here, I'm sure, but it doesn't matter. The 525 works on an inertia changeover trigger. So once the trigger is pulled, you can pull that trigger to your heart's content with snap caps in there, and nothing will actually happen. What needs to happen is a bang to change it, to push this block back, to drop this sear downwardly, and for this sear then to re-engage via a little spring inside the trigger here onto the next sear. And suddenly, you can see this hammer at the back here, tumbler, bang! A very simple device. And providing you're putting correct power cartridges through this gun, you will never have an issue. And even then, after a certain point, it will even cycle light loads or change over with light loads very proficiently. This is slightly different. And to be fair, even when you just look at it, you've got all these little cutaways and fancy machining marks, even on the trigger here, which actually I think is a lovely little feature that everyone can appreciate. All these little machining marks to actually make these parts, well, lighter, more efficient, more streamlined maybe. Whereas on this, it's all still quite old and looks quite, well, engineering. So without really wanting to sound derogatory towards it, because it is simple and there's nothing wrong with that, let's move over to the 725, the more engineered version. So anybody asking why a 725 may be more when some things are similar is quite simply that the insides are more engineered and probably slightly better finished out of the box. This has a mechanical trigger, and how this works is quite simple. And we'll reference the 525 quickly. These mainsprings are simple. They can go on back to front, front to back, and nothing makes much of a difference whatsoever. They are a straight line. On this 725, you'll notice you have a bulbous bit in the middle. So instead of just a standard coil that one could in a pinch make at home, they are slightly more complicated. That being that this raised bit in the middle, well, let's show you is the simple part. And let's talk about it first. So let's start by talking about the basics of how this action works. It's not so simple as the 525 down there. It is. The trigger connects to an internal sear directly connected through a little pin in the middle of the trigger. And that is in here, and you can see that moving around side to side when I move that safety catch. Selector even. When you push it forward, that engages with this top sear, which connects into this bent here. When I pull the trigger, this spring expands, pushing the hammer forward to hit the pin striker at the back here that hits the cartridge. They're held in place by this little pin here. And here's where it gets exciting, is that this large expanded McDonald's eating part of the spring here pushes forward and then pushes this up. What that does is, so when we open the 525, what we'll see again, you need that inertia or you're going to stay on there on that front sear or the first sear forever and a day. What this does is when this block rises, is it just pushes the block back. So you ready? And so it all happens very, very quickly. That's it. That is as simple as it. That is the spring expands, pushes this up and just disconnects the trigger sear back onto the next, from one sear and back onto the next. And it really is as simple as that. And bang, mechanical triggers in a 725 over and done with. So there you have it. That is very much how the 725 and a 525 work, and that is the main differences between them. There is no benefit to one or the other than that 725 will consistently give you a second bang even if you have a first barrel misfire. This could be potentially happy in a competition scenario where you've got full use of the gun on a single bird and your gun maybe fails to go off on that first shot, and more importantly will be exciting if you're shooting game and you have the same issue. For example, let's say you accidentally chuck it in the wrong barrel and don't want to play with a selector, you can go click bang. And having that ability to go click bang might get you either a kill instead of a loss, or a bird in the bag rather than a hungry belly. So the 75 being slightly more expensive does have a more complex trigger unit, or it's not more complex, a next generation trigger unit, because for that is really all it is just the next generation. Other things that you'll notice is the whole profile of the action is slimmer, and we've already done this comparison, so it doesn't matter too much, but it is worth noting, is the 525 is 68mm and the 725 is 65mm at the front of the action. At the back of the action, 46mm, and on the 725, 44.5mm. It's not a great deal because, again, there is a certain width of neck of stock that you need to remain strong and non-breakery. And that pretty much is it. Width obviously changes ever so slightly between them as well, is that the 525 is 39mm and the 725 is 40mm. Much like the 686 actually and the 690, to become squatter they need to become wider. Even though actually the whole internals of the action appears thinner, they're actually at this joint pin here 1mm wider on the 725. And that is that. A very simple internal explanation of the differences between a 525 and a 725. So the internal heading of the stocks is actually identical. The ejection system is pretty much identical. The trigger unit is different. The hammers on the 725 are squatter to fit in the frame and actually thinner and more engineered, but as part of that have still retained the strength of the larger hammer through more engineering, or more machining probably is a better phrase of that. The 725 also has a slightly different hammer spring in that it is squatter and fatter, and as such you have less lever movement on this than you do on the 525. Apart from that, well, I was going to say there's no difference. They are born of the same mother. The top sears on the 525 are bigger and on the 75 are smaller. That's also important as well, and that is what gives you a slightly better connection, and more importantly, it gives you a better trigger on the 75 than the 525. And the 525 is an evolution from the original supervised triggers to get them better and better, but there's only so much you can do with this design to make the triggers good, which has always been a down point by comparison to certain detachable trigger guns that have become popular purely based on the fact that the triggers are the tits. And that is as simple as that. Well, there you have it. The real answer is there is differences, but I wouldn't say one is significantly better than the other. One is potentially more modern, more complex, and takes advantage of modern machining significantly more. One is potentially slightly outdated, if you like, by modern machining methods and standards. However, it works and has worked for many, many years. So you can't really draw any conclusions other than to say they're different. Guys, thanks so much for watching. It has been brilliant, and we'll see you next time.